The gunshot that rang out across the Arizona Territory that morning in 1878 wasn't what changed Olivia Crawford's life forever. It was the singing that came after. She'd been standing outside the Mercantile in Camp Verde, clutching a list of supplies her father needed for their struggling ranch, when the sound of shattering glass and shouting erupted from the saloon across the dusty street. Men poured out onto the wooden walkway, and in the chaos, Olivia found herself frozen in place as a wild-eyed outlaw stumbled backward, firing his pistol into the air. The bullet hit the awning above her head, sending splinters of wood raining down, and she might have stood there until something worse happened if a strong hand hadn't grabbed her arm and pulled her into the narrow alley between the Mercantile and the bank. "Stay down," a man's voice said, low and urgent. Olivia pressed herself against the rough wooden wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear the commotion continuing in the street, the thunder of horses' hooves as the town marshal and his deputies gave chase. Slowly, she turned her head to look at her rescuer. He was tall, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. His face was tanned and weathered in the way that spoke of long days under the sun, but there was something gentle in his expression that immediately set her at ease, despite the circumstances. He couldn't have been much older than 25, she judged, perhaps 6 or 7 years her senior. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his voice carried the same gentleness as his eyes. Olivia shook her head, finding her voice. "No, I'm fine. Thank you for pulling me out of harm's way." "Frank Nelson," he said, extending his hand. "I own the Triple N Ranch about 5 miles north of town." She took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work. "Olivia Crawford. My father has a small spread east of here, the Broken Sea." Recognition flickered across Frank's face. "Martin Crawford's daughter. I've heard of your father's place. Times have been hard for the smaller ranchers." "That's one way to put it," Olivia said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. The drought had hit them hard and her father's health had been failing. At 18, she'd taken on more and more of the ranch work, but it was never enough. They were drowning in debt, and everyone in Camp Verde knew it. The sound of the commotion had faded now, moving further down the main street. Frank peered around the corner of the building, then nodded. "I think it's safe now. Those were the Garrett brothers, I'd wager. They've been causing trouble up and down the territory." As they stepped back onto the walkway, Olivia became aware of other townspeople emerging from doorways and alleys where they'd taken shelter. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house was fanning herself dramatically, while old Tom Foster was already spinning the tale to anyone who would listen, making the incident sound far more dramatic than it had been. "I should get my supplies and head back," Olivia said, suddenly aware that she'd been staring at Frank Nelson longer than was strictly proper. There was something about him that drew her attention, something beyond his obvious good looks. Perhaps it was the way he'd acted without hesitation to help her, or the genuine concern in his eyes. "Let me help you load your wagon," Frank offered. "It's the least I can do after such an exciting morning." Olivia wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the independence she'd fought so hard to establish, but the truth was she could use the help. The supplies her father needed were heavy, and the clerk at the Mercantile, Mr. Simmons, had a bad back and couldn't assist much anymore. Inside the Mercantile, Frank helped her gather flour, beans, coffee, and the few other items they could afford. As Mr. Simmons tallied the cost, Olivia counted out the coins from her worn leather purse, painfully aware that this would leave them with almost nothing until they could sell some cattle at the end of the month, if they made it that long. As Frank carried the sacks out to her wagon, a battered old thing that had seen better days. Olivia found herself watching the way he moved with easy confidence. He loaded the supplies carefully, making sure everything was secure, then turned to her with a smile that made something flutter in her chest. "Thank you again, Mr. Nelson," she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Frank, please," he said. "And it was my pleasure, Miss Crawford." "Olivia," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. He tipped his hat to her, and she climbed up onto the wagon seat, taking the reins in her hands. As she guided the horses toward the edge of town, she glanced back once and saw him still standing there, watching her go. The ride back to the Broken Sea took nearly an hour, and Olivia used the time to try to push Frank Nelson out of her thoughts. She had no business thinking about any man, let alone a successful rancher who probably had his pick of eligible women in the territory. The Crawford ranch was failing, her father was sick, and she had work waiting that wouldn't do itself. When she pulled the wagon up to the small ranch house, she found her father sitting on the porch, his face drawn and pale. Martin Crawford had once been a strong man, capable of working sun up to sundown without complaint, but the illness that had taken hold of him over the past year had stolen that strength. Now, at 53, he looked 20 years older. "Did you get everything?" he asked, his voice rough. "Everything on the list," Olivia replied, climbing down from the wagon. She didn't mention the incident in town, knowing it would only worry him. "How are you feeling today?" "About the same," he said, which meant not good. "The cattle in the north pasture need checking. I saw from the window that a few of them were looking poorly." Olivia nodded, already mentally rearranging her afternoon. She'd need to unload the wagon, make lunch, check on the cattle, repair the fence in the east pasture that had been damaged in last week's windstorm, and somehow find time to work on the accounts. The money situation was getting desperate, and she'd been avoiding looking at the ledger for days, afraid of what she might find. By the time evening came, Olivia was exhausted. She'd made a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, which her father had picked at without much appetite, and then she'd finally forced herself to sit down with the account books. The numbers were worse than she'd feared. They were 3 months behind on the loan payment to the bank, and their cattle weren't in good enough condition to fetch decent prices at market. She sat at the kitchen table long after her father had gone to bed, the lamp burning low, trying to figure out some solution that didn't end with them losing everything. Her mother had died when Olivia was 12, taken by fever, and since then it had been just her and her father. He'd poured everything into this ranch, and she couldn't stand the thought of watching it slip through their fingers. The next few days passed in a blur of hard work and worry. Olivia rose before dawn each morning, tending to the animals, mending fences, hauling water from the creek that was running lower every day. The drought showed no signs of breaking, and the sky remained a relentless, cloudless blue. She was in the barn, mucking out the horse stalls when she heard the sound of an approaching rider. Wiping the sweat from her forehead, she stepped out into the bright sunlight, shading her eyes with her hand. Her breath caught when she recognized the rider. Frank Nelson sat astride a handsome chestnut gelding, and he smiled when he saw her. "Good morning, Olivia. I hope I'm not intruding." "Mr. Nelson," she said, suddenly aware of her dirt-stained work dress and the state of her hair, which had come loose from its braid and hung in tangles around her face. "What brings you out this way? Frank, remember." He dismounted with easy grace, holding the reins loosely in one hand. "I was riding my property line and realized I was close to your ranch. I wanted to check that you made it home safely the other day after the trouble in town." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it, but Olivia found herself pleased nonetheless. That's kind of you. Yes, the ride home was uneventful, thankfully. Frank glanced around the ranch, and Olivia tried to see it through his eyes. The house needed paint, the barn roof had a few missing shingles, and the corrals showed signs of hasty repairs. It was the look of a place that was barely hanging on, and she felt a flush of shame. "Your father around?" Frank asked, his tone casual. "He's resting inside. He hasn't been well." "I'm sorry to hear that." Frank paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Listen, I know we don't know each other well, but I've heard about the difficulties facing the smaller ranchers in the area. The drought has been hard on everyone, but especially those without deep reserves. I wanted to offer some help if you'd be willing to accept it." Olivia stiffened. "We're managing fine, thank you." "I didn't mean to offend," Frank said quickly. "I just thought maybe if you needed an extra hand or some advice on water management or even just someone to help move cattle to better grazing land, I'd be happy to assist. Neighborly cooperation, that's all." Pride warred with practicality in Olivia's chest. They did need help desperately, but accepting charity from a man she barely knew, a man who made her feel things she had no business feeling, seemed dangerous in more ways than one. Before she could respond, her father's voice called from the house. "Olivia, who's there?" "A neighbor, Pa," she called back. "Frank Nelson from the Triple N." Martin Crawford appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on his cane. He studied Frank with sharp eyes that hadn't lost their keenness despite his illness. "Nelson, I've heard of you. Your father built that ranch up from nothing." "Yes, sir," Frank said respectfully. "He passed 3 years ago, left it to me." "Good man, your father," Martin said. He moved slowly down the porch steps, and Olivia resisted the urge to rush to his side, knowing he hated being treated as an invalid. "What brings you to the Broken Sea?" Frank repeated his offer of assistance, and Olivia watched her father's face carefully. She saw the same pride she felt warring with the same practicality, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like calculation. "That's a generous offer," Martin said slowly. "Tell me you married Nelson?" "Pa," Olivia felt her face flame red. Frank, to his credit, didn't seem flustered. "No, sir, haven't found the right woman yet." Martin said, a sound that conveyed more than words. "Well, we could use some help, I suppose. Olivia's been running herself ragged trying to keep this place going. If you've got time to spare, we'd be grateful for the assistance." "It would be my pleasure," Frank said. "I can come by a few times a week, help with whatever needs doing." And so it began. Frank started showing up at the Broken Sea 3 or 4 times a week, always in the morning, always ready to work. He helped Olivia repair fences, move cattle to better grazing, and shore up the barn roof. He brought advice about water conservation, and offered to let them move some of their herd to a creek on his property that was still running strong. At first, Olivia tried to maintain a polite distance, but it was impossible when they were working side by side in the hot sun, day after day. Frank was easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor that surprised her and a gentleness in his manner that put her at ease. He asked about her life, seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, and treated her like an equal partner in the work rather than just a woman who needed his help. One afternoon, as they were taking a break in the shade of the barn, sharing water from the canteen, Frank pulled out a harmonica from his pocket. "Do you mind?" he asked. "I like to play when I take a rest." "Go ahead," Olivia said, curious. The melody that flowed from the harmonica was sweet and melancholy, a tune that spoke of wide open spaces and lonely nights. Frank played with his eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music, and Olivia found herself transfixed. When he finished, she realized she'd been holding her breath. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "What was it?" Just an old trail song I learned from one of my ranch hands, Frank said, tucking the harmonica back in his pocket. Music's always been important to me. My mother used to sing all the time when I was growing up. She said music could lighten the hardest work and ease the deepest sorrow. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, Frank said, a note of sadness in his voice. She died when I was 15. Fever took her, same as a lot of folks that year. My mother too, Olivia said. I was 12. The house felt so empty after she was gone. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, bound by shared loss. Then Frank said, "Do you sing?" Olivia felt her throat tighten. "I cannot sing," she said, the words coming out more forcefully than she'd intended. "I mean, I have a terrible voice. It's just awful, like a cat being strangled," my mother used to joke. She had a beautiful voice, and I think it disappointed her that I didn't inherit it. Frank looked at her with such warmth in his eyes that it made her chest ache. "Then I'll sing for both of us," he said simply. Everyone should have music in their life, one way or another. And he did. From that day on, whenever they worked together, Frank would sing old trail songs, hymns his mother had taught him, ballads he'd learned from traveling cowboys. His voice was rich and true, and Olivia found herself looking forward to their work sessions as much for the singing as for his company. As the weeks passed, Olivia realized she was falling in love with Frank Nelson. It crept up on her slowly, in the way he always seemed to know when she needed help before she asked, in the gentle way he spoke to her father, in the sound of his voice raised in song. She tried to fight it, knowing that she had nothing to offer a man like him, but it was like trying to stop the sun from rising. One evening, after Frank had left for the day, Martin called Olivia into the house. He was sitting in his chair by the window, the one that gave him a view of most of the ranch yard. "Sit down, daughter," he said. "We need to talk." Olivia sat, her stomach knotting with apprehension. "Is something wrong? Are you feeling worse?" "I'm not going to get better, Olivia," Martin said bluntly. "We both know that. The doctor told me months ago that this illness would take me eventually. I've made my peace with it." "Pa, don't talk like that. Hush and listen," he said, but his tone was gentle. "I won't be around to take care of you much longer, and this ranch is going under no matter what we do. The debt is too great, and we don't have the resources to turn things around. But you have your whole life ahead of you. Where is this going?" Olivia asked, though she had a sinking feeling she knew. "Frank Nelson is a good man," Martin said. "He's kind, hardworking, and he's got a successful ranch. More than that, he looks at you the way a man should look at a woman he cares for. And unless I'm blind as well as dying, you look at him the same way. Pa, I can't just throw myself at the man because we need money. That's practically prostitution." Martin's face darkened. "That's not what I'm saying, and you know it. I'm saying that sometimes opportunities present themselves, and we'd be fools not to recognize them. Frank's not helping us out of pity, Olivia. He's helping us because of you. The question is, do you have feelings for him?" Olivia stared at her hands. "What I feel doesn't matter. We're about to lose everything. He's a successful rancher who could have his pick of women. Why would he want someone like me?" "Because you're strong, intelligent, capable, and beautiful," Martin said firmly. "And if he's half as smart as I think he is, he already knows you're worth 10 of those simpering town girls who have never done a day's work in their lives." The conversation stayed with Olivia over the next few days. She found herself watching Frank more carefully, trying to discern his true feelings. Did he really care for her, or was he just being kind to struggling neighbors? The answer came sooner than she expected. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Frank had brought over some lumber to help repair the chicken coop that had been damaged by a coyote the night before. They'd worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and the heat was oppressive. Olivia had gone to the well to draw fresh water when she heard the sound of singing drifting from the barn. She stood still, listening to Frank's voice soaring through a ballad about lost love and second chances. The words spoke of a lonely man who'd thought he'd never find someone to share his life with, until fate brought her to his door. When the song ended, Olivia found herself walking toward the barn without consciously deciding to do so. Frank was inside, putting away the tools they'd been using. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression made him go still. "That song," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you mean it?" "Every word," Frank said, setting down the hammer he'd been holding. "Olivia, I know this probably isn't the right time, and I know you've got enough worries without me adding to them, but I can't keep pretending that I'm just being neighborly. I come here because I want to see you. I think about you all the time. When I'm working on my ranch, I'm wishing you were there. When I wake up in the morning, my first thought is whether I have an excuse to come by today." Olivia's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Frank, you don't understand. We're drowning in debt. My father's dying. I have nothing to offer you except problems." "You're offering yourself," Frank said, taking a step closer. "That's everything." "I'm not some charity case for you to rescue," Olivia said, even as she ached to close the distance between them. "I won't be the poor neighbor girl you took pity on." "Is that what you think this is?" Frank's voice was rough with emotion. "Olivia, I fell for you the moment I pulled you into that alley in town. I saw your strength, your courage, the way you didn't fall apart even though you must have been terrified. Every day since then has only made me more certain that you're the woman I want to spend my life with." "I cannot offer you anything," Olivia said, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "I cannot even sing." Frank closed the distance between them, gently cupping her face in his hands. "Then I'll sing for both of us," he said, echoing his words from weeks before. "For the rest of our lives, if you'll let me. Marry me, Olivia. Not because it makes financial sense, not because your father's dying, but because I love you and I think you might love me too." "I do," Olivia whispered. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "Then say yes," Frank said. "Say you'll marry me." "Yes," Olivia breathed, and then his lips were on hers and the world fell away. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Camp Verde. Olivia wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, and Frank wore his best suit. Martin Crawford was there, weak but smiling, and a handful of neighbors who'd come to wish them well. The preacher's words washed over Olivia in a blur, and all she could focus on was Frank's eyes, warm and full of love, and his hand holding her steady. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at Frank's ranch, the Triple N. Olivia had been there a few times during their brief courtship, but now she looked at it with new eyes. This was her home now. The ranch house was bigger than what she'd grown up in, built of sturdy wood with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Inside, it was clean but sparse, clearly the home of a bachelor who'd been living alone. "I know it needs a woman's touch," Frank said, watching her take it all in. "I want you to change anything you like, make it feel like yours." "Ours," Olivia corrected softly. "It's ours now." That night, as they lay together in the big bed in the master bedroom, Frank held Olivia close and sang softly to her, an old lullaby his mother had sung. Olivia felt safe for the first time in months, maybe years, cradled in his arms with his voice wrapping around her like a blanket. The next morning, reality returned with the harsh light of day. Martin Crawford was still dying, the broken sea was still drowning in debt, and Olivia had responsibilities there that she couldn't simply abandon. Frank, reading her thoughts as he seemed so often able to do, brought it up over breakfast. "We'll ride over to the broken sea today," he said. We need to figure out a plan for taking care of your father and dealing with the ranch situation. Frank, that debt is crushing. I won't let you take it on just because you married me. We're partners now, Frank said firmly. Your problems are my problems. Besides, I've been thinking about this. The Broken Sea land borders mine. If we combine the ranches, we'd have access to that water source on the southern edge of your property, and we could use your land for winter grazing. It makes good business sense. And the debt. We'll talk to the bank, Frank said. I've got credit with them. We can work something out. They rode to the Broken Sea that afternoon and found Martin sitting on the porch, as was his habit. His face brightened when he saw them arrive together, and Olivia felt a pang of bittersweet emotion. Her father looked happy but also relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Over the next few days, Frank made good on his word. He met with the banker, Mr. Patterson, and arranged to take over the debt on the Broken Sea in exchange for combining the properties. It was a complex arrangement that involved legal documents and long discussions, but in the end, the Broken Sea was saved, at least in name. It would become part of the Triple N operation, and Martin would be able to live out his remaining days in the house he'd built without the fear of losing it. Olivia moved her father into one of the spare bedrooms at the Triple N Ranch house, which was closer to town, and the doctor Martin protested at first, insisting he didn't want to be a burden, but Olivia wouldn't hear of it. She wanted him close, wanted to be able to care for him in his final months or weeks or however long he had left. As autumn turned to winter, a routine established itself. Olivia helped Frank run the expanded ranch operation, learning aspects of ranching she'd never dealt with before. She discovered she had a talent for managing the business side, keeping meticulous records and finding ways to stretch their resources. Frank handled most of the physical work with his ranch hands, though Olivia still insisted on doing her share. The best times were the evenings, when the work was done and they could sit together on the porch, watching the sun set over the Arizona landscape. Frank would play his harmonica or sing, and Olivia would lean against his shoulder, content in a way she'd never imagined possible. Martin's health continued to decline through the winter. By Christmas, he was confined to his bed most days, though his mind remained sharp. On Christmas Eve, with a fire crackling in the hearth and snow falling gently outside, the three of them sat together in Martin's room. "I want you to know," Martin said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "that I'm dying a happy man. Olivia, seeing you settled with a good man, knowing you'll be taken care of, that's all a father can ask for." "Pa, don't," Olivia said, tears streaming down her face. "Hush now," Martin said gently. "Death comes for all of us eventually. I've had a good life, more good than bad, and I'm ready. Frank, you take care of my girl." "With my life, sir," Frank said, his own eyes glistening. "And Olivia," Martin continued, "you remember that your mother and I loved you more than anything in this world. You made us proud every single day." Martin Crawford passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days later. They buried him on a hill overlooking the Broken Sea, with a simple wooden cross to mark the spot. The preacher said words about ashes and dust, and several neighbors came to pay their respects. Olivia stood dry-eyed through the service, held upright by Frank's arm around her waist, but that night she finally broke down and sobbed in her husband's arms. "He was all I had left of my family," she wept. "Now I'm alone." "You're not alone," Frank said fiercely, holding her tight. "You'll never be alone again. I'm your family now, and I promise you, Olivia, I will spend every day of my life making sure you never feel that kind of loss again." True to his word, Frank was her rock through the dark days of grief that followed. He took on extra work around the ranch so she could have time to mourn. never complained when she woke up crying in the middle of the night, and gently coaxed her back to life with his patience and love. Spring came late to Arizona that year, but when it arrived, it brought with it a breaking of the drought. The rains came in abundance, filling the creeks and turning the brown landscape green. The cattle fattened up, and the ranch began to truly prosper. One evening in April, Olivia realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week before allowing herself to hope, and then another week to be sure, before finally telling Frank. They were in the barn, checking on a mare that was due to foal any day when Olivia said, "Frank, I have something to tell you." He looked up from examining the mare's belly, and something in her expression made him abandon his task and come to her. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm pregnant," Olivia said, and then she was laughing and crying at the same time. "We're going to have a baby." Frank let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses, then swept Olivia up in his arms and spun her around. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We're going to have a baby." "Put me down, you crazy man," Olivia laughed. "You'll make me dizzy." But Frank was already singing, a joyful melody about new beginnings and blessed events, and Olivia found herself caught up in his happiness. They danced there in the barn, hay dust motes swirling in the lamplight, until they were both breathless with laughter. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. Olivia continued to work on the ranch, though Frank fretted constantly about her overdoing it. She felt strong and healthy, blooming with the life growing inside her, and refused to be treated like an invalid. In late October, as the leaves were turning gold and red in the cottonwoods along the creek, Olivia's labor began. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. The doctor from Camp Verde attended her, along with Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, who'd helped deliver half the babies in the territory. Frank paced outside the bedroom door, forbidden entry by Mrs. Henderson's strict rules, singing softly to himself as if he could somehow convey his strength to Olivia through the walls. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, he nearly broke down the door in his haste to get inside. "You have a son," the doctor announced, cleaning up the squalling infant. "A healthy boy." Frank rushed to Olivia's side, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. She looked exhausted but radiant, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, and when Mrs. Henderson placed the baby in her arms, she looked up at Frank with such love in her eyes that he felt his heart might burst. "He's perfect," Olivia whispered, tracing the baby's tiny features with one finger. "Look at him, Frank. He has your eyes." "And your stubbornness, I'd wager," Frank said, his voice choked with emotion. "What should we name him?" They'd discussed names for months but never settled on anything. Now, looking at their son, Olivia knew exactly what felt right. "Martin," she said, "after my father, Martin Nelson." "Martin it is," Frank agreed, gently touching the baby's downy head. "Welcome to the world, little Martin. Your grandfather would have been so proud." The years that followed were good ones. Young Martin grew into a healthy, rambunctious boy with his father's easy temperament and his mother's determination. The ranch continued to prosper, and Frank and Olivia's reputation as fair employers and good neighbors spread throughout the territory. When Martin was 3, Olivia gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Sarah, who kept the household in a state of cheerful chaos. 2 years after that, another son arrived whom they named James. The ranch house, once so empty and sparse, was filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing. Through it all, Frank never stopped singing. He sang while he worked, sang to the children at bedtime, sang to Olivia when they had rare moments alone together. His music had become the soundtrack of their life together, a constant reminder of how far they'd come from that day in Camp Verde when gunshots had brought them together. Olivia discovered that while she still couldn't carry a tune to save her life, she loved music fiercely. She taught the children to appreciate their father's songs, and as they grew older, they began to learn instruments themselves. Martin showed a talent for the guitar, while Emma had inherited her grandmother's supposedly beautiful singing voice. One evening, when Martin was 10 and the twins were 7 and James was 5, the whole family gathered on the porch after supper. It had become a tradition, this evening time together, where work was set aside and they simply enjoyed each other's company. Frank had his guitar, Martin had his smaller one, and Emma was ready to sing. "What should we play tonight?" Frank asked, looking around at his family with contentment. "That song about the trail drive," Martin suggested. "The one with the fast part." "No, the one about the stars," Emma countered. "I like that one better." "Can I play the harmonica, Pa?" James asked, holding up the child-sized harmonica Frank had given him for his birthday. "Everyone can play," Frank said, laughing. "We'll do both songs. Olivia, you just sit there and look beautiful and be our audience." "I'm quite content with that role," Olivia said, settling back in her rocking chair with a smile. She had baby Thomas, just 6 months old, sleeping in her arms, the 5th addition to their family. As her husband and children filled the evening air with music, Olivia looked out over the land that had once been 2 struggling ranches and was now a thriving operation. The Triple N had expanded over the years, and they now employed 15 ranch hands and had one of the largest herds in the territory. But none of that mattered as much as this, these moments with her family, safe and loved and happy. She thought about the frightened 18-year-old girl she'd been, standing outside the mercantile in Camp Verde, thinking her life was over before it had truly begun. If she could go back and tell that girl what was waiting for her, that the gunshot that day would lead to everything good in her life, she would have. "Ma, you're crying," Martin said, interrupting the song. "Are you sad?" "No, sweetheart," Olivia said, wiping her eyes. "I'm happy. Happier than I ever thought possible." Frank set down his guitar and came to kneel beside her chair, taking her free hand in his. "What brought this on?" "Just remembering," Olivia said. "That day in town when you pulled me into the alley, do you remember?" "Every detail," Frank said softly. "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, even covered in dust and scared half to death." "I was so lost back then," Olivia said. "I thought my life was just going to be struggle and hardship and loss. I never dreamed I could have all this." "We're blessed," Frank agreed. "Every single day we're blessed." The children, sensing the importance of the moment even if they didn't fully understand it, gathered around their parents. Frank pulled them all into a group embrace, and Olivia felt surrounded by love so strong it was almost tangible. "Tell us the story again," Emma asked. "About how you and Ma met." It had become one of the children's favorite tales, and Frank obliged, embellishing certain parts for dramatic effect while Olivia interjected corrections. The children listened with rapt attention, even though they'd heard it dozens of times before. When the story reached the part about Frank offering to sing for both of them, little James asked, "But Ma, can you really not sing at all?" "Not a note," Olivia confirmed cheerfully. "It's truly terrible." "But that's okay," Frank said, winking at his children, "because I can sing enough for the whole family. And your Ma does plenty of other things better than anyone else I know." "Like what?" Sarah asked. "Like keeping this ranch running smoothly," Frank said. "Like raising you children to be good, kind people. Like making me the happiest man in Arizona every single day." "You're getting sappy in your old age," Olivia teased, though her eyes were soft. "I'm only 32, Frank protested. "That's not old." "Ancient," Martin declared, grinning, and then shrieked with laughter as Frank grabbed him and tickled him mercilessly. The evening dissolved into play and laughter, and eventually, Olivia herded the children inside for bed. Frank helped tuck them in, singing a different lullaby for each child, a tradition he'd started when Martin was born. When all 5 children were finally settled, Frank and Olivia stepped out onto the porch for a few moments of quiet before heading to bed themselves. The Arizona night was clear and cool, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Olivia leaned against Frank's side, his arm around her shoulders, and breathed in the scent of sage and creosote that always perfumed the desert air. "You ever regret it?" Olivia asked quietly. "Taking on me and all my problems, you could have had someone with less baggage." "Not this again," Frank said, but his tone was gentle. "Olivia, you weren't baggage, you were a gift. The best thing that ever happened to me was pulling you into that alley and getting to know you. Everything good in my life started that day." "I love you," Olivia said, "more than I can ever find words for." "Then it's a good thing I can sing," Frank said, and he began to hum the melody of the love song he'd sung in the barn all those years ago, the one that had led to their first kiss. Olivia closed her eyes and let his voice wash over her, still as moved by it as she'd been that very first time. She thought about all they'd been through together, the worry and struggle of those early days, the grief of losing her father, the joy of their children being born, the countless small moments that made up a life together. "I was thinking," Frank said when the song ended, "maybe we should throw a big party here at the ranch next month. Invite all the neighbors, have music and dancing and good food. We've been blessed, and I'd like to share that blessing with others." "That's a wonderful idea," Olivia said. "We could set up tables in the yard, string lanterns in the trees. The children would love it." They spent the next hour planning the party, their voices low so as not to wake the sleeping children inside. By the time they finally went to bed, Olivia's mind was full of happy plans and her heart was full of gratitude. The party, when it happened a month later, was everything they'd hoped for and more. It seemed like half the territory showed up, ranchers and townspeople alike, drawn by the Nelsons' reputation for hospitality and the promise of Frank's music. Tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes, and someone had brought a piano out from town on a wagon, setting it up in the yard. Frank gathered musicians from among the guests, forming an impromptu band, and soon the yard was filled with dancing couples. Olivia stood on the porch, watching it all with a smile, bouncing baby Thomas on her hip. "You should be out there dancing," Mrs. Henderson said, coming to stand beside her. The older woman had become a good friend over the years, serving as grandmother figure to the Nelson children. "I'm happy right here," Olivia said, "watching everyone enjoy themselves." "You've built something special here," Mrs. Henderson said. "You and Frank both. This ranch, your family, the way you treat people, it's special." "We've been lucky," Olivia said. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "It was hard work, love, and treating each other right. That's what makes a good life." Frank appeared at that moment, slightly out of breath from dancing, his face flushed and happy. "There you are," he said to Olivia. "I've been looking for you. Come dance with me." "I have the baby," Olivia protested. "I'll take him," Mrs. Henderson said, plucking Thomas from Olivia's arms. "Go dance with your husband." Frank led Olivia out into the yard, where the band had struck up a slower tune. He pulled her close, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers, and they moved together in easy rhythm. "Are you happy?" Frank asked, echoing the question she'd asked him so many times over the years. "Deliriously," Olivia said. "You, more than I can say," Frank replied, "although I do have one complaint." "What's that?" We've been so busy with the ranch and the children that we haven't had enough time just for us, Frank said. I was thinking maybe in the spring, after Thomas is weaned, we could take a trip. Just the two of us. Maybe to Santa Fe or even Denver. See some sights, have some adventures, remember what it's like to be just Frank and Olivia instead of Ma and Pa. I'd like that, Olivia said, warming to the idea. It's been years since we've had time alone together. Then it's settled, Frank said. Spring trip, just the two of us. Mrs. Henderson can watch the children. The party continued late into the night, and when the last guest had finally departed and the children had collapsed into their beds, exhausted from excitement, Frank and Olivia stood together in the quiet yard, looking at the debris of the celebration. We'll clean it up tomorrow, Frank said, seeing Olivia eye the scattered plates and cups. Tonight, let's just enjoy the peace. They walked down to the creek, hand in hand, following the path they'd worn over the years. The water burbled softly over the rocks, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. Sing for me, Olivia requested, settling down on their favorite rock, the one that had a smooth, flat surface perfect for sitting. Frank sat beside her and sang, his voice floating out over the water. He sang the old songs and the new ones, ballads and trail songs and hymns. He sang until his voice grew hoarse, and then he sang some more, because Olivia asked him to, and he'd never been able to deny her anything. When he finally stopped, Olivia leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for singing for both of us just like you promised." "It's been my honor," Frank said. "Every single day." The years continued to pass, bringing changes both large and small. The children grew, the ranch expanded, and Arizona moved from territory to statehood in 1912. Frank's hair began to show silver at the temples, and Olivia found laugh lines creasing her face, but they wore their age well, comfortable in their own skin and with each other. Martin, their eldest, took over more and more of the ranch operations as he grew into manhood, showing the same steady competence and fairness that Frank had always displayed. At 20, he married a sweet girl named Catherine from Camp Verde, and within a year, made Frank and Olivia grandparents for the first time. The twins, Emma and Sarah, were as different as two people could be despite being identical in appearance. Emma inherited her father's love of music and eventually moved to Phoenix to teach at a music school, while Sarah stayed on the ranch, developing a talent for horse training that brought buyers from across the territory. James showed an interest in medicine, and with his parents' support and the money carefully saved from the ranch's profits, went east to study at a proper medical school. He returned to Arizona to practice, setting up an office in Camp Verde and becoming the most trusted doctor in the region. Baby Thomas, who wasn't a baby anymore, followed in his father's footsteps completely, taking to ranching like he'd been born to it, and showing the same gift for music that Frank had. Through all the changes, the ranch remained the center of the family. Even the children who moved away returned often, bringing their own children in time, and the house Frank had once rattled around in alone was never quiet for long. Olivia and Frank took their trip to Denver in the spring of 1905, and it was everything they'd hoped for. They stayed in a real hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, went to the theater, and spent hours just walking the city streets hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing. On their last night, they attended a concert at a grand theater, and Frank held Olivia's hand throughout, occasionally leaning over to whisper commentary about the musician's technique. "You miss performing?" Olivia asked afterward, as they walked back to their hotel. Frank had told her stories over the years about playing at gatherings when he was younger, before his father died and the responsibility of the ranch had consumed all his time. "No," Frank said thoughtfully. "I have the best audience I could ask for right at home. You and the children and the grandchildren, that's all I need." When they returned home, they found the ranch running smoothly under Martin's capable management, and the children all healthy and happy. Mrs. Henderson reported that baby Clara, Martin and Catherine's daughter, had slept through the night twice, which was apparently a major accomplishment. Life settled back into its comfortable rhythm, but the trip had reminded both Frank and Olivia of the importance of making time for each other, and they made a point after that to take regular rides out to their favorite spots on the ranch, away from the bustle of the household. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1898, Frank had surprised Olivia by building a small gazebo near the creek, the spot where he'd sung to her so many times over the years. It became their special place, somewhere they could escape to when the children were particularly rambunctious, or when they just needed a moment of peace together. It was there, on a warm evening in June of 1915, that they sat together watching the sunset. Olivia was 55 now, Frank 62, and both of them were feeling their age more than they cared to admit. But they were still together, still in love, and that was all that mattered. "Do you remember," Frank said, breaking the comfortable silence, "that day in the barn when I asked you to marry me?" "Every detail," Olivia said. "I was covered in dust and sweat, and I'm sure I looked a mess." "You looked beautiful," Frank corrected, "and terrified. I thought for a moment you might say no." "Never," Olivia said. "Even though I was scared and didn't understand how it could work, I knew I loved you. I couldn't have said no if I'd tried." "Best decision either of us ever made," Frank said. He pulled out his harmonica, the same one he'd played that day in the shade of the broken Seaticus barn decades ago, and began to play the melody that had started it all. Olivia closed her eyes and listened, transported back through the years to that hot afternoon when Frank had first offered to sing for both of them. So much had happened since then, so much joy and sorrow and ordinary life, but through it all, Frank's music had been the constant thread, weaving their days together into something beautiful. When the song ended, Olivia opened her eyes to find Frank watching her with the same expression of love and wonder he'd worn on their wedding day. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Just thinking about how blessed I am," Frank said. 55 years I've been on this earth, and the best 37 of them have been knowing you. The best 20 have been being married to you." "Only 20. We've been married for 37 years, Frank." "I know," Frank said with a grin. "The first 17 years of our marriage, the children kept us so busy and exhausted I barely remember them. The last 20, with most of them out of the house, that's when the real fun began." Olivia laughed, swatting his arm playfully. "You're incorrigible." "And you love me anyway," Frank said, pulling her close. "I do," Olivia agreed, resting her head on his shoulder. "More than anything in this world." They sat in peaceful silence as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and red. The sounds of the ranch drifted to them on the evening breeze. Cattle lowing, horses nickering, the distant sound of Martin's voice calling to one of the ranch hands. "I've been thinking," Frank said eventually. "Maybe it's time to step back even more, let Martin run things completely. We've earned a rest, you and I." "What would we do with ourselves?" Olivia asked, though the idea was appealing. "This," Frank said simply. "Spend time together, spoil the grandchildren, take more trips if you'd like. Maybe I could finally teach you to sing." "That's a lost cause, and you know it," Olivia said, laughing. "Then I'll just keep singing for both of us," Frank said. "That's worked out pretty well so far." "It has," Olivia agreed. She thought about the young woman she'd been, convinced she had nothing to offer, unable to even carry a tune. Frank had taken her exactly as she was and loved her not despite her flaws but including them, seeing them as part of what made her unique. Over the next few years, they did exactly what Frank had suggested. Martin took over full operation of the ranch, with Thomas working as his second in command. Frank and Olivia remained involved, offering advice when asked, but they were free to spend their days as they pleased. They traveled a bit, visiting Emma in Phoenix and James in Camp Verde, taking a memorable trip all the way to San Francisco to see the ocean. But mostly, they were content to stay home, surrounded by their growing family. The ranch continued to prosper under Martin's management, and the Nelson name became synonymous with quality cattle and fair dealing throughout Arizona. The children and grandchildren came and went, always welcome, always finding a haven at the ranch. On Frank and Olivia's 40th wedding anniversary, the family threw a massive celebration. All 5 children returned home with their spouses and children, filling the ranch house to bursting. There were 18 grandchildren now, ranging from Martin and Catherine's eldest, who was approaching 20, to James's youngest, who was barely a year old. The celebration lasted 3 days, with music and food and laughter filling every corner of the ranch. On the final evening, as the sun was setting, Frank gathered his children and grandchildren around him in the yard. 40 years ago, he began, his voice still strong despite his 67 years, I married the most remarkable woman I'd ever met. She was brave and strong and capable, but she told me she had one flaw: she couldn't sing. The grandchildren giggled, having heard this story before, but they listened attentively as Frank continued. So I told her I'd sing for both of us, Frank said, and I have every day for 40 years. But what I didn't tell her then, because I didn't have the words for it yet, was that she's been singing all along. Not with her voice, but with her life. The way she built a home filled with love, the way she raised you children to be good people, the way she supported me through every challenge, that's all been a song more beautiful than anything that could come from vocal cords. Olivia, sitting beside him, had tears streaming down her face. Frank Nelson, after 40 years you can still make me cry. Only because I love you, Frank said, taking her hand, and because it's all true. He picked up his guitar, the same one he'd been playing for decades, worn smooth by countless hours of use, and began to sing. This time, though, he wasn't alone. His children joined in, and then the grandchildren, until the evening air was filled with the sound of the Nelson family raised in song. Olivia sat in the center of it all, surrounded by the life she and Frank had built together, and she thought her heart might burst with happiness. This was what mattered, she realized. Not the ranch or the money or the success, but this. Family, love, connection, the threads that bound them all together across the years. As the song ended and the family began to drift apart, heading to bed or to continue conversations in smaller groups, Frank and Olivia remained sitting together as they had so many times before. 40 years, Olivia mused. Where did the time go? Into this, Frank said, gesturing at the ranch, the children, the life they'd built. Every second of it. You have any regrets? Olivia asked, a question she'd asked him many times over the years. Not a single one, Frank said, his answer the same as always. None, Olivia said. Except maybe that I still can't sing. Frank laughed, the sound rich and warm in the gathering darkness. Then I'll keep singing for both of us, he said, for as long as I have breath in my body. He did exactly that. Through the years that followed, as they both grew older and slower, Frank continued to fill their days with music. When Olivia's joints grew stiff with age and she couldn't do the work she once had, Frank sang to ease her frustration. When Frank himself began to feel the weight of his years, Olivia would request his favorite songs, and he'd play and sing, his voice wavering a bit now but still true. They celebrated their 45th anniversary quietly, just the two of them and their children, in the gazebo by the creek. They marked 50 years with another big party, though Frank tired more easily now and had to take breaks between songs. In the spring of 1920, when Olivia was 60 and Frank was 67, they took one last trip together. Frank had always wanted to see the Grand Canyon, and Martin insisted on arranging it, complete with a comfortable wagon and two of the gentlest horses on the ranch to pull it. They spent 3 weeks traveling slowly across Arizona, camping under the stars, talking about their life together and all the memories they'd accumulated. When they finally reached the rim of the canyon and looked out at that vast expanse, both of them were struck silent by the beauty. "Makes you feel small, doesn't it?" Frank said eventually. "And grateful," Olivia added, "for every single moment we've had together." They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, two people who'd traveled through life together and arrived at this moment still connected, still in love. The journey back to the ranch was leisurely, and when they finally arrived home, they were both exhausted but happy. The ranch looked exactly as it always had, welcoming and familiar, and Olivia felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. "Home," she said simply, and Frank nodded in understanding. Their final years together were quiet ones. Frank's health began to decline slowly, his movements becoming more careful, his breathing sometimes labored. But his mind remained sharp, and his love of music never faded. Even when his fingers grew too stiff to play the guitar easily, he could still coax melodies from his old harmonica. Olivia stayed by his side through it all, as devoted at 65 as she'd been at 18. She read to him when his eyes grew tired, sat with him on the porch during the warm afternoons, and listened to him sing in the evenings, his voice not as strong as it once was but still carrying the same love. On a cool evening in October of 1925, with the cottonwoods turning gold and a harvest moon rising over the ranch, Frank sat in his favorite chair on the porch, Olivia beside him as always. He'd been quiet all day, and Olivia knew in her heart that his time was coming. "Sing for me," she requested, as she had so many times over the years. Frank picked up his harmonica, the same one he'd played that very first day in the barn at the Broken Sea, and began to play. The melody was the one he'd played all those years ago, the trail song about wide open spaces and lonely nights, but now it spoke of a life fully lived, of love found and cherished. When the song ended, Frank lowered the harmonica and looked at Olivia with eyes that had seen 47 years of her face and never grown tired of the sight. "I love you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day, every moment I have loved you." "And I have loved you," Olivia said, taking his hand. "Thank you for singing for both of us all these years." "It was my joy," Frank said, "my greatest joy." He closed his eyes then, still holding Olivia's hand, and quietly slipped away, as peacefully as a man could hope for, surrounded by love and music and the land he'd worked his whole life. Olivia sat with him for a long time, holding his hand as it slowly grew cool, tears streaming silently down her face. She knew she should call for the family, that there were things that needed to be done. But for just a little while longer, she wanted to sit with her husband one last time, to say goodbye to the man who'd been the center of her world for nearly half a century. They buried Frank Nelson on the hill next to Olivia's father, overlooking both the original Broken Sea land and the Triple N that had been his legacy. It seemed fitting that the two men who'd meant the most to Olivia should rest in sight of each other, watching over the land they'd all worked so hard to build. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Arizona, Frank had been well loved, respected for his fairness, his generosity, and his gift for bringing people together through music. The preacher spoke of a life well lived, and Martin sang one of his father's favorite hymns, his voice breaking but holding strong. After the funeral, as the family gathered back at the ranch house, Olivia stood alone for a moment in Frank's room, looking at his guitar propped in the corner, his harmonica sitting on the nightstand. The room still smelled like him, leather and sage and something uniquely Frank, and she felt the full weight of her loss crash over her. "Ma," Emma's voice came from the doorway. "Are you all right?" "No," Olivia said honestly, "but I will be, eventually." Emma came to her mother's side, wrapping an arm around her waist. "He loved you so much. We all saw it every single day." "I know," Olivia said. "And I loved him. That's what makes this so hard." In the months that followed, Olivia learned to navigate life without Frank. It was harder than she'd imagined, even though she'd known this day would eventually come. Everything reminded her of him. The porch where he'd sung, the creek where they'd spent so many evenings, the bed they'd shared for 47 years that now felt too big and empty. But she wasn't alone. Her children rallied around her, taking turns staying at the ranch to keep her company. The grandchildren visited constantly, filling the house with noise and life. And slowly, painfully, Olivia began to heal. One evening, about 6 months after Frank's death, Olivia was sitting on the porch watching the sunset when young Thomas came to join her. He was 30 now, married with 3 children of his own, but he'd always been especially close to his mother. "I have something for you," he said, sitting down beside her. He held out Frank's old harmonica. "Pa gave this to me before he died, told me to keep it safe until you were ready for it." Olivia took the harmonica with trembling hands. It was warm from being in Thomas's pocket and worn smooth from decades of use. "I can't play it," she said. "I know," Thomas said gently, "but maybe you'd like to keep it anyway, to remember." "I don't need a harmonica to remember your father," Olivia said, but she clutched it to her chest anyway. "He's in every corner of this ranch, in every one of you children, in every breath I take." "He also left you something else," Thomas said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "A letter. He wrote it last year, gave it to Martin to give to me to give to you." He was very specific about the timing. Olivia unfolded the letter with shaking hands and began to read. "My dearest Olivia," it began in Frank's familiar handwriting. "If you're reading this, then I've gone on ahead and left you behind, which is the only part of dying that bothers me. I hate to think of you grieving, but I know you well enough to know that you are. So let me tell you this one last time. Loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. From that day in the alley in Camp Verde to whatever day I draw my last breath, you have been my joy, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. You told me once that you couldn't sing, and I told you I'd sing for both of us. I hope I kept that promise. But I want you to know that in all the years we had together, you were always singing. Your love was a song I heard every day, in the way you smiled at me across the breakfast table, in the way you ran this ranch with such competence and grace, in the way you raised our children to be good people. Don't grieve too long, my love. I'm not truly gone, not as long as you and the children and the grandchildren remember me. I'm in the songs they sing, in the land we built together, in the love that fills this ranch. Live fully, Olivia. Laugh often. Spend time with our family. Sit by the creek and remember the good times we had. And if you ever feel lonely, pick up my old harmonica and know that I sang for both of us right up until the end, and I'm singing still, somewhere beyond what we can see. All my love, forever and always, Frank. By the time Olivia finished reading, tears were streaming down her face, but they were different tears than she'd been crying for months. These were tears of gratitude, of love, of the bittersweet ache of a life fully shared and now transformed by loss but not destroyed by it. "Thank you," she said to Thomas, carefully folding the letter. "Your father always knew exactly what to say." "He loved you so much, Ma," Thomas said. "We all did. We all do." Olivia wiped her eyes and looked out at the ranch, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The Triple N was still going strong, still providing for the family Frank had started, still standing as a testament to what two people could build when they loved each other and worked together. "Tell me," she said to Thomas, "do you remember any of your father's songs?" "All of them," Thomas said. "He made sure of that." "Would you play something for me?" Olivia asked. On his harmonica. Thomas took the harmonica and began to play, and the melody that emerged was the same one Frank had played that very first day, the trail song that had started everything. Olivia closed her eyes and listened, and in the music, she could hear Frank's voice singing, as clear as if he were sitting beside her. In the years that remained to her, Olivia lived fully, as Frank had urged her to do. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, watching them grow and build their own lives. She saw Martin expand the Triple N even further, saw Emma become a renowned music teacher in Phoenix, saw Sarah breed horses that were sought after throughout the Southwest, saw James save countless lives with his medical skill, saw Thomas carry on his father's legacy of combining ranching and music. She became a great-grandmother and then a great-great-grandmother, and the ranch house was never empty of family. On holidays and birthdays and ordinary weekends, the Nelson family would gather, and there would be music, always music, in honor of the man who'd started it all. Olivia lived to be 88 years old, staying sharp and active almost to the end. When she finally passed peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1948, surrounded by 3 generations of family, she was laid to rest on the hill between her father and her husband, the 3 people who'd loved her most. At her funeral, all 5 of her children sang, along with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The music that rose from that hilltop was a chorus of love and remembrance, a tribute to the woman who couldn't sing but whose life had been a song nonetheless. Martin, now 70 and the patriarch of the family, spoke at the service. "My mother used to say she couldn't sing," he told the gathered crowd. "And technically, that was true. But she and my father together created a harmony that sustained them through 47 years of marriage and continues to resonate in all of us who came after. They showed us what love looks like, what partnership means, and how to build something lasting." As the family dispersed after the service, returning to their own lives and homes, the Triple N Ranch remained, still standing strong after more than 70 years. The original house had been expanded and updated, but the bones of it were still the same. The land was still being worked, still producing, still providing for the Nelson family. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right across the Arizona landscape, some said you could hear the faint sound of a harmonica playing, a melody of love and loss and life fully lived, a cowboy singing for his wife who couldn't carry a tune, keeping his promise even beyond death. "I'll sing for both of us." The story of Frank and Olivia Nelson became part of the family lore, passed down through generations. It was told to children as a bedtime story, shared with new spouses entering the family, whispered between young couples falling in love themselves. It became a reminder that true love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but about 2 people choosing each other day after day, year after year, through all the challenges and joys life brought. The Triple N Ranch continued to thrive through the decades, through wars and depressions and all the changes that swept across America. It remained in the Nelson family, passed down from generation to generation, a testament to what Frank and Olivia had built together. And in the small cemetery on the hill, 3 simple headstones stood together. Martin Crawford, beloved father and grandfather; Franklin Nelson, husband, father, and friend to all; and Olivia Crawford Nelson, beloved wife, mother, and heart of the Triple N. But they were more than names on stone. They were a love story, written in the land itself, in the legacy of family they'd created, in the music that continued to echo through the ranch house on summer evenings when the family gathered. They were proof that sometimes the most beautiful songs are the ones lived rather than sung, and that the promise, "I'll sing for both of us," could sustain a love through a lifetime and beyond, a harmony that would never truly end.